Clara Whitmore did not cry when they lowered her husband into the ground. She cried the morning she realized she had 43 cents, 4 daughters, and a broken wagon axle in the middle of a stranger's land with no one coming to help. She had nothing left to offer the world. Nothing but 4 little girls who were counting on her to keep breathing. If this story moves you, subscribe and follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The mule stopped moving at noon, and that was when Clara Whitmore understood that God had officially run out of mercy for her. She stood in the middle of a rutted dirt road that cut through the red Oklahoma grassland like an old scar, one hand gripping the lead rope, the other pressed flat against the side of the wagon to steady herself. The heat came up from the ground in waves that made everything shimmer at the edges, and the air smelled like iron and dust and something dry that had been burning somewhere far off. The wagon was not going anywhere. She had known that since dawn, when the right rear wheel had begun grinding against the axle with a sound like a man gritting his teeth. She had pushed it another 4 miles through sheer stubbornness before the axle gave out entirely with a sound like a rifle shot. The wagon tilted hard to the right, and all 4 of her daughters had slid sideways against the wooden slats and yelped. "Mama," Annie said from the wagon bed. She was 5 years old and had been crying on and off since breakfast. Her voice was thin and cracked at the edges, the way a voice gets when the tears have mostly dried up, but the feeling behind them hasn't. "Mama, I'm thirsty." "I know, baby," Clara said without turning around. "Give me a minute." "You said that a long time ago." "I know I did." She let go of the lead rope, walked around to the back of the wagon, and looked at the axle. Looked at it the way a person looks at a thing they already know is ruined, not studying it, just confirming what their gut already told them. The wood was split clean through. Not cracked. Split. There was no fixing that on the side of a road with no tools, no lumber, no hardware, and 43 cents in a handkerchief tucked inside her left boot. Abby was already standing beside her. Abigail Whitmore, 13 years old, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's unsmiling jaw. She had one hand tucked inside her apron pocket, and Clara knew without asking what was in it. She had found the kitchen knife 3 weeks ago and said nothing because she understood why her daughter was carrying it. "Both sides of the axle," Abby said. "Yes." "Can we tie it?" "No." Abby looked at the axle for another moment. Then she looked up at the road ahead, which went on and on through the grass until it disappeared into nothing. "How far to the next town?" "I don't know," Clara said. 12 miles maybe. Could be more." "In this heat?" "Yes." Abby did not say anything after that. She just stood there, and Clara could see her daughter doing the same arithmetic she was doing, measuring the distance against the water left in the barrel, against Annie's legs, that were too short for 12 miles of hard walking, against Grace's shoes that were already held together with twine. Lydia jumped down from the wagon without being asked. She was 10 brown as a walnut from the sun, and she walked straight to the mule and put both hands on its nose and spoke to it in a low voice that Clara couldn't quite hear. The mule shifted its weight and blew a long breath but didn't try to pull away. Lydia had always had a way with animals that Clara could not explain and had long since stopped trying to. Grace climbed down after her, clutching the family Bible to her chest with both arms. She was 7, and she had not let go of that Bible since the morning they left Kansas. Clara had told her once that she didn't need to carry it everywhere, and Grace had looked at her with those quiet eyes and said, "Daddy touched every page. I don't want to put it down." Clara had not brought it up again. "What are we going to do?" Grace asked. "We're going to think," Clara said. "And then what?" "Then we're going to do something." Grace considered this seriously the way she considered most things. "Okay," she said, and sat down on the side of the road with the Bible in her lap. Annie climbed over the wagon sideboards on her own, which she was not supposed to do, and landed in the dirt with a thump and an expression that suggested she was very pleased with herself. Her face was streaked from crying, and her hair had come entirely out of its braids. She walked straight to Clara and wrapped both arms around her mother's legs and pressed her face against Clara's hip and said nothing at all. Clara put her hand on top of Annie's head and held it there. She did not let herself think about Thomas. She had made a rule about that, not in front of the girls, not on the road, not when she needed to be the one holding things together. Thomas Whitmore had been dead for 3 months, and she had not yet let herself come apart over it. And she was not going to start now in the middle of a dirt road in Oklahoma with a broken axle and a thirsty 5-year-old. She would think about Thomas later, in the dark when the girls were asleep. That was when she allowed it. She was still standing there, Annie against her hip, trying to work out what came next when Abby said, "Mama." The tone of it made Clara turn. A rider was coming from the south, coming at an easy pace, not hurrying, not charging, just a man on a horse moving along the edge of the grass toward the road. He was still far enough away that Clara couldn't make out his face, just the shape of him. Broad-shouldered hat, low one hand resting on the saddle horn. She felt Abby move closer to her, and she knew without looking that her daughter's hand had gone deeper into that apron pocket. "Stay here," Clara said quietly. "I'm not, Abby." The look she gave her daughter was not harsh. It was just the look that meant this is not a negotiation, and Abby recognized it and pressed her lips together and stayed. Clara took 3 steps forward away from the wagon and waited. The rider came up to the road and stopped about 15 feet away. He was a big man, not in the way that meant threatening, just solidly built, the kind of frame that came from years of physical work, rather than intention. He had a dark beard, not well kept, but not wild either, and his eyes under the hat brim were a quiet gray. He looked at the wagon. He looked at the tilted axle. He looked at the 4 girls. His face did not change much, but something shifted in his eyes, and Clara couldn't tell what it was. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Sir," she said. She kept her voice even. He looked at the axle again. Axle split. "Yes." "Both sides." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. His horse stood perfectly still underneath him, which told Clara something about the man. A nervous man had a nervous horse. "This is Boone land. You're stopped on," he said, not threateningly, just stating it. "I didn't choose where the axle broke," Clara said. The corner of his mouth moved just slightly. "No, I don't expect you did." He looked at the girls again. "How long have you been out here?" "Since about 8 this morning." He looked at the sun. It was past noon, probably closer to 1. He pulled off his hat and ran a hand through his hair and put it back. "You got water?" "Some." "How much is some?" She didn't answer that. She didn't answer it because the answer was almost none, and she was not ready to say that out loud to a stranger. He seemed to understand the silence. He unhooked a canteen from his saddle and held it out toward her, but not toward her, toward the girls. He held it in the direction of Annie. "For the little one," he said. "She sounds like she needs it." Clara hesitated 1 full second. She had learned to be careful with charity. Charity always cost something. But Annie was 5 years old, and her lips were cracked, and the heat was brutal, and Clara Whitmore was a proud woman, but not a foolish one. "Lydia," she said, "get the canteen, please." Lydia crossed to the horse without the slightest hesitation, took the canteen from the man's hand, looked up at him briefly with frank appraising eyes, and carried it back to Annie. Annie drank with both hands wrapped around the canteen, and the sound of her drinking was the most ordinary thing in the world and the most heartbreaking. "My name's Elias Boone," the man said. "This is my land on both sides of this road for the next 3 miles. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "We'll be off your land as soon as I can figure out how." "Where are you headed?" "Oklahoma City." He looked down the road. "That's about 60 miles south." "I know how far it is." "On foot." "We'll manage." He looked at her then. Not in a rude way, not in the way men sometimes looked at women on the road, assessing them like livestock. He looked at her the way a person looks at a problem they are trying to solve. Quietly, carefully. "Ma'am, you've got 4 children, a broken wagon, a tired mule, and it's 102 degrees, he said. "I don't know what managing looks like under those conditions, but I don't think it looks good. "With respect, Mr. Boone, that is not your concern." "Maybe not," he said, "but it's my land. And I've got a ranch house half a mile south with a well and a kitchen and a barn that could shelter this wagon." He paused. "I'm not offering anything improper. I'm offering supper and a place to sleep, and in the morning we can see about the axle." "We don't accept charity," Clara said. The words came out harder than she intended, sharp-edged from practice. "It isn't charity," he said simply. "My fence posts need painting, and my garden's gone to weeds since April. If your girls are willing to work, I'll call it fair trade." Abby made a sound behind her. Clara didn't turn around, but she heard it, that slight shift in her daughter's stance that meant she was listening now instead of just guarding. "One night," Clara said. "That's all I'm offering." She studied him for another moment. He didn't fill the silence with reassurances or smiling or talking. He just sat there on his horse and let her look at him, and something about that steadiness made her trust him a half-degree more than she would have otherwise. "All right," she said. "One night." He nodded once and dismounted. He tied his horse to the back of the wagon with a practiced knot, and then he crouched down and looked at the axle with his hands, not his eyes, running his fingers along the split. "I've got spare timber at the ranch," he said. "Won't be a permanent fix, but it'll hold you 60 miles if you don't push the mule too hard." "You can fix it." "I can try." He stood up and dusted his knees. "I'm not a blacksmith, but I've fixed enough broken things to know which ones are worth trying." Annie had finished the canteen and was now standing 6 inches behind Elias Boone, staring up at the back of his head with enormous, curious eyes. He must have felt it because he turned. Annie did not back away. She just looked at him with the open, undefended expression of a child who has not yet learned the full weight of stranger danger. "You're very tall," she said. "I've been told," he agreed. "Do you have any little girls?" Something passed across his face. It was quick, and he smoothed it over fast, but Clara caught it, that brief closing off like a shutter pulled against a window. "No," he said. "I don't." "We have too many," Annie offered helpfully. "Mama says so." "Annie," Clara said. "She does. She says 4 is a lot of mouths." Elias Boone looked at Clara. There was something in his expression that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same neighborhood. "4 is a lot of mouths," he agreed. "Good thing I've got a garden." He reached for the mule's lead rope, and Lydia, who had been watching him handle the horse with careful attention, stepped forward and said, "I can lead him. He knows me." Elias Boone looked at her for a moment. "All right, miss," he said and stepped aside. Lydia took the rope, clicked her tongue twice, and the mule started walking. They moved south along the road, Elias walking beside the wagon with his horse trailing behind Lydia, leading the mule, Grace walking with the Bible pressed to her chest, Annie trotting to keep up with Elias's long strides and asking him questions he answered in short, honest sentences. Clara walked beside the wagon and watched all of this and felt something uncomfortable and complicated moving around in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet and wasn't ready to examine. Abby walked beside her, close. Her hand was still in her apron pocket. "He could be anybody," Abby said low enough that only Clara could hear. "Yes," Clara agreed. "We don't know anything about him." "No." "Then why are we going—" Clara looked at Annie trotting alongside a stranger in the heat, asking him if cowboys ever got lonesome. She looked at Grace, who was flagging in the sun. She looked at Lydia, who was talking to the mule in her low animal language. "Because we don't have another choice," she said. "There's always another choice," Abby said. "Name one." Abby was quiet. "That's what I thought," Clara said. "Keep your hand in that pocket if it makes you feel better, but walk." Tuck. Elias Boone's ranch house was not what Clara expected. She had expected bachelor disorder dishes, piled floor, unswept, the particular chaos of a man living alone without anyone to answer to. Instead, the house was clean, in the way that empty things are clean. The floors were swept. The dishes were stacked. The curtains at the windows were faded, but not dirty. Everything was in its place. Everything was in its place, because nothing had moved in a long time. She understood it the moment she walked through the door. This was not the house of a man living carelessly. This was the house of a man keeping something exactly as it had been left. Every object had a purpose and a position, and none of them had been touched in a way that suggested joy or accident or the natural disorder of daily life. It was a house preserved, not lived in. She did not say anything about it. She just walked to the kitchen and found the fireplace and started learning where things were. Elias pumped water from the well while Abby carried it bucket by bucket without being asked. Grace found a broom and swept the porch. Annie sat on the kitchen floor and hummed to herself while Clara worked. Lydia disappeared into the barn with the mule, and they didn't see her again for 45 minutes. Elias came inside while Clara was working at the stove and stopped just inside the doorway, the way a man stops when he enters a room and finds it different than he left it. Clara had not rearranged anything. She had just lit the fire and put a pot on and found the dried beans in the pantry and started them soaking, and the smell of something cooking filled the kitchen for what was probably the first time in months. He stood there for a moment without speaking. "I hope you don't mind," Clara said, not turning around. "I found the beans." "No," he said. "I don't mind. There wasn't much else in the pantry. I don't keep a lot of food, just for one." She turned then. He was looking at the pot on the stove with an expression she recognized, the look of a person who has gotten used to not having something and forgotten how much they missed it until it was suddenly there again. "Sit down, Mr. Boone," she said. "You look like you haven't eaten a proper supper in a while." "I eat fine," he said. "You eat," she said. "That's not the same thing." He sat. Grace climbed up onto the bench across from him and set the Bible carefully on the table beside her and folded her hands. She looked at him with her thoughtful, unhurried eyes. "What happened to your wife?" she asked. "Grace," Clara said. "It's all right," Elias said. He looked at Grace. "Fever," he said. 3 years ago. "Did you love her very much?" "Grace?" "Yes," he said. "Very much." Grace nodded slowly, the way she nodded when she was filing something away in that careful internal catalog of hers. "Our daddy died too," she said. 3 months ago. "Mama doesn't cry in front of us, but we can hear her at night sometimes." The kitchen was very quiet. Clara kept her back to the table and did not move. "I'm sorry to hear that," Elias said, his voice low and even. "Mama says it's okay to miss people," Grace said. "She says missing someone just means you love them right." "Your mama sounds like a smart woman," Elias said. "She is," Grace agreed. "She's also very tired." "Grace," Clara said quietly, "why don't you go see if Lydia needs help in the barn?" Grace slid off the bench, obediently picked up the Bible and went to the door. She paused there and looked back at Elias. "Thank you for letting us stay," she said. "I think God sent us here on purpose. I think sometimes He breaks things so people can find each other." She went out. The door swung shut behind her. Clara turned back to the stove. She could feel the back of her neck warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire. After a moment, Elias said, "She's something." "All 4 of them are something," Clara said. "They're everything I have left in this world." "I can see that." She stirred the beans. "Mr. Boone, I want to be clear about our arrangement. We are grateful for the shelter. I intend to earn every hour of it with work, and we will not overstay. As soon as the axle is repaired, we'll be on our way." "Understood," he said. "And whatever people in town might say about a widow woman staying under a single man's roof, I want you to know I don't intend to cause you any difficulty." He was quiet for a moment. "Who's going to say anything?" "Someone always does," Clara said flatly. "In every town, someone always does." Supper was beans and cornbread and the last of a jar of preserved peaches Clara found at the back of the pantry. Elias looked at the peaches when she set them on the table and said nothing, but Clara saw his jaw tighten for just a moment, and she thought maybe they had belonged to someone else, and she thought maybe she should have left them on the shelf. But Annie had already spotted them and said, "Peaches, with the reverence of a child receiving a gift from heaven, and there was no walking that back. They ate around the table, all 5 of them, plus Elias at the head. Annie ate her peaches one careful slice at a time, saving them like a ceremony. Grace asked Elias if he had any books. He said there were some in the front room. Her eyes lit up in a way that made her look briefly like the child she was supposed to be. Abby ate without saying a word to anyone. She watched Elias with steady, unreadable eyes the entire meal, and Elias, to his credit, did not try to win her over. He did not ask her questions or compliment her or try to make her laugh. He just ate his supper and passed the bread when it was needed and left her alone, which was the exactly correct thing to do, and Clara noticed it. After supper, Elias went to the barn to check on the mule. Annie followed him because Annie followed everyone. He stopped at the barn door and looked down at her and said, "You ought to ask your mama before you go following people around, miss." "Mama knows where I am," Annie said. "Does she?" "She always knows. She's a mama." He considered this. "Fair enough," he said, and held the barn door open for her. Clara was washing the supper dishes when she heard it. Not a sound from outside, a sound from the front room. She dried her hands and walked to the doorway and looked in. Elias was sitting in the chair beside the cold fireplace, and Annie was asleep in his lap. Just like that, she had climbed up and fallen asleep with her head against his chest, and her mouth slightly open the way 5-year-olds do when sleep takes them without warning. He sat very still, his arms held slightly out from his sides like a man who has been handed something fragile and is not sure of the protocol. He looked up when Clara appeared in the doorway. He looked helpless and alarmed, and something else, something soft at the very edges that he was trying very hard to keep contained. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She climbed up. I didn't." "She does that," Clara said quietly. "I didn't want to disturb her." Clara crossed the room and scooped Annie up carefully. Annie stirred, mumbled something about peaches, and went back to sleep with her face against Clara's shoulder. Clara straightened and looked at Elias. He was looking at his hands in his lap. His jaw was tight. He was doing something private and painful that she had interrupted by walking in, and she thought she understood what it was, and she was sorry for it, and she didn't know how to say so, without making it worse. "Thank you, Mr. Boone," she said, "for all of this." "It's just supper," he said. "It's more than just supper," she said, "and you know it." She carried Annie toward the back room. At the doorway she stopped. "That jar of peaches," she said. "I'm sorry. I should have asked." He didn't answer for a moment. Then, "She canned them herself, the summer before she died. I've been looking at that jar for 2 years, and I never could." He stopped. It was better this way. Somebody should have eaten them. Clara stood there in the doorway with her sleeping daughter pressed against her shoulder, and she felt the weight of everything this man was carrying not so differently from the weight she carried herself. 2 people on opposite sides of the same grief standing in the same kitchen eating peaches off the same shelf. "Good night, Mr. Boone," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Gutcheg." She found Abby still awake when she laid Annie down. Abby was sitting on the floor beside the window in the thin blue dark, her knees pulled up to her chest. She still had her hand in her apron pocket. "You should sleep," Clara said. "I don't trust him," Abby said. Clara sat on the edge of the bed. "I know. He's being too nice. Men who are too nice too fast want something." "Sometimes they do," Clara said. "Sometimes they're just lonely." Abby was quiet. Then, "I heard what Grace said to him, at supper, about you crying at night." "Grace says what she thinks." "She shouldn't have said that." "No, probably not." Clara looked at her daughter in the dark, this 13-year-old girl who had been carrying a knife in her apron for weeks, who had stepped in front of her mother on the road without being asked, who had not let herself cry once since the morning they buried Thomas. "Abby, put the knife away tonight." "Mama." He fixed us a meal and gave us a roof, and he sat very still for 20 minutes, because your little sister fell asleep in his lap. She reached out and put her hand on Abby's knee. "Put the knife away. Not forever. Just tonight." Abby looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into her apron pocket and set the kitchen knife on the floor beside her and left it there. "I still don't trust him," she said. "You don't have to," Clara said. "That's my job. Your job is to sleep." Abby lay down, still dressed, and closed her eyes. Clara sat beside her until her breathing changed. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the dark Oklahoma land and the stars that went on and on and on above the grass, and she let herself just for a moment think about Thomas, about the way he had laughed, about the way he had looked at her in the early years, like she was the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass and let the coolness of it move up her arm. "I'm trying," she whispered, to him, to the dark, to whoever was listening. Then she took her hand off the glass, turned away from the window, and went to sleep. Outside in the barn, Elias Boone sat on a hay bale with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and his eyes on the floor, and he thought about peaches in a jar on a shelf, and a little girl who had fallen asleep like she trusted the whole world, and a woman who had said, "It's more than just supper," and meant it. And he thought about how it was possible for a house to be empty for 3 years, and then, in the space of one afternoon, to feel like something had returned to it that he hadn't even known was gone. He sat there a long time. Then he blew out the lantern and lay down in the hay and listened to the summer wind moving through the grass and somewhere on the ridge above the south pasture. If he had known to look, a man named Silas Crow sat on a dark horse in the dark and watched the lights in Elias Boone's windows go out one by one, and smiled to himself because he already knew how to use what he had seen today. He always did. Morning came without ceremony. Clara was up before the sun. She had always been that way. Thomas used to say she woke up fighting, like sleep was something she had to defeat every day just to get back to the business of living. She built the fire, found flour and lard in the pantry, and had biscuits in the pan before the first bird outside made a sound. Elias came through the back door while the biscuits were still in the oven. He stopped when he smelled the smoke from the stove and the warm bread smell behind it. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and an expression on his face like a man who has walked into the wrong house and is trying to decide whether to stay. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know I didn't." Clara did not turn around. "Sit down. Coffee's ready." He sat. She poured. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at it for a moment before drinking, and she thought again about that jar of peaches and the way he had said somebody should have eaten them, the voice of a man who had been talking himself out of things for a long time. "About the axle," he said. "Yes. I've got oak planks in the barn, strong ones. I can brace the split and band it with iron strap. It won't be pretty, but it'll hold." "How long will it take?" "Most of the day. Maybe into tomorrow morning." Clara pulled the biscuits from the oven and set them on the table. She sat down across from him and folded her hands and looked at him directly, the way she always did when she needed to understand something. "Mr. Boone, I need to know plainly, are you in a situation where having us here causes you trouble?" He met her eyes. "What kind of trouble are you thinking of?" "The kind that comes from neighbors," she said. "The kind that travels on gossip." He set down his cup. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've been ranching this land for 11 years. People around here know who I am." "They know who you are when you're alone," Clara said. "They don't know what to make of you with a widow woman and 4 girls in your house. And there are always people who are very eager to decide." Something shifted in his expression. Not defensiveness, something more honest than that. "Has that been a problem for you before?" "After Thomas died, I had 3 neighbors offer to help me," she said. 2 of them wanted something in return that I wasn't willing to give. The 3rd was genuine, but by the time I worked out which was which, I'd already lost the house." She picked up a biscuit and set it on his plate with the flat efficiency of a woman who has no patience left for circling around things. "So, yes, Mr. Boone, it's been a problem before." He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm not those men," he said finally. "I didn't say you were. I said I need to know plainly." She looked at him steadily. "So, Does our being here cause you trouble or not? He picked up the biscuit. Not the kind you're worried about, he said. Then what kind? He took a bite and chewed it slowly and looked at the wall behind her head for a moment, like a man choosing his words from a smaller set than usual. The kind that comes from getting used to having people around, he said, and then having them leave. Clara did not know what to do with that, so she did what she always did. When something caught her off guard, she stood up, went back to the stove, and started doing something with her hands. Then we'll leave before it becomes a problem, she said. That's what I figured you'd say. She heard something in his voice that she didn't answer, and the kitchen was quiet after that, except for the fire and the sound of the biscuits cooling on the pan. Lydia was in the barn at first light. Elias found her there when he went to pull the oak planks standing outside the stall of the difficult mare, a dark bay with a white blaze and an eye that showed too much white when strangers came near. He'd bought her 2 springs ago from a man who hadn't been kind to her, and she'd been half wild ever since, too good to sell and too unpredictable to trust. Lydia was standing 3 feet from the stall gate, with both arms loose at her sides, not looking at the horse directly, just existing near her. The mare had her head over the gate, and her ears flicked forward. Elias stopped and watched. "What's her name?" Lydia asked without turning around. She'd heard him come in. "Don't have one. I just call her the Bay." Lydia frowned slightly. She needs a name. Maybe so. What was she like before? Before what? Before whoever had her before you. He set down the planks he was carrying and leaned against the barn wall. I don't know exactly. I bought her from a man who wasn't good to her. She's been nervous ever since. Lydia nodded slowly. She took one small step toward the stall. The mare's ears pinned back, then released. She's not nervous, Lydia said. She's waiting. Waiting for what? To find out if you're going to be like him. She glanced back at Elias briefly. Animals do that. They remember bad things longer than they remember good ones, so you have to give them enough good ones to fill up the space. Elias looked at this 10-year-old girl who had probably never been taught a thing about horses formally in her life, speaking about memory and patience and trust with a steadiness that most grown men didn't have, and he felt something move through his chest that was not easy to categorize. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "I didn't learn it," she said. "I just know it." She took another half step toward the mare. The horse blew a long breath through her nose but didn't pull back. "Her name's Clover," Lydia said. "You're naming my horse?" She already knew the name. "I just told you what it was." Elias stood there for a moment, then picked up his planks and walked toward the wagon. "Clover," he said, testing it. In the stall, the mare's ears swiveled toward the sound of his voice. Abby spent the morning inside, moving through the house with a quiet efficiency that matched Clara's own. She swept. She reorganized the pantry. She found a ledger book on the shelf near the front room and sat down with it and opened it and began reading through it with the focused attention of someone who understood what they were looking at. When Elias came in for a cup of water mid-morning, he found her at the table with the ledger open and a crease between her brows that made her look considerably older than 13. "That's mine," he said, not harshly. "I know." She didn't close it. "You're behind on your water assessment." He stopped. "Beg pardon?" "The Territorial Water Board. There's a notice in here from April saying you owe $42 in assessment fees by the end of summer, or they can put a lien on the water rights to Dry Creek." She looked up at him. "Did you forget about it, or were you ignoring it?" Elias set his water cup down on the counter. He looked at the ledger. He looked at Abby. "How old are you?" 13. "And you can read a financial ledger." "Daddy taught me," she said. "It came out flat and final the way statements come out when you're not inviting any discussion about the person they concern." He said women who can't read their own numbers end up dependent on men who can, and that's a bad position to be in. Elias pulled out the bench across from her and sat down. "Your daddy sounds like he was a smart man." "He was." She looked back at the ledger. You've got enough cattle income from the spring sale to cover the assessment and still have operating money left for the winter. But you haven't filed the payment. Why not? He was quiet for a moment. I've been distracted. By what? He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them blinked. By things that are harder to face than numbers, he said finally. Abby studied him with those steady dark eyes for a long moment. Then she looked back at the ledger. You need to file this by September 15th, she said. That's 6 weeks. If you don't, a man named Silas Crow can put in a competing claim. There's a note here. It looks like he's already submitted interest in the water rights. The air in the kitchen changed. Elias stood up slowly. Let me see that. She turned the ledger around and pointed. He leaned over the table and read the note, a clipped formal letter tucked into the back of the ledger, the kind that comes from a man who knows how to use legal language like a weapon. It was dated 3 weeks ago. Silas Crow, representing Crow Land and Cattle Enterprises, had submitted a formal notice of interest in the water rights to Dry Creek contingent on any lapse in Elias Boone's assessment payments. He had been so careful for so long, watching that water creek, knowing Crow wanted it paying every assessment on time for 11 years. And then Margaret had died, and the world had gone gray and distant, and somewhere in the fog of the last 3 years, he had simply stopped paying attention. This has been sitting in your ledger for 3 weeks, Abby said. I know. You didn't read it. I haven't opened that ledger since. He stopped. Since a while. Abby looked at him with the expression of someone who has just understood something they didn't want to understand. Oh, she said, quietly, without pity, which was the right way. How bad is it? He asked. She looked at the ledger again. She pulled it back toward herself and ran her finger down a column of figures with a focus that he could only watch. It's not bad yet, she said. But it will be if you don't act fast. You need to get to the land office in Guthrie before Crow moves again. She paused. And you need to be careful. A man who submits a legal notice like this while his neighbor isn't paying attention is a man who's been watching and waiting for exactly the right moment. Elias straightened. He looked at this 13-year-old girl who had arrived on his land less than 24 hours ago, with a kitchen knife in her apron pocket, and a deep suspicion of every person she met, and who had just saved his ranch without being asked. Thank you, Abby, he said. She closed the ledger. I'm not doing it for you, she said. I'm doing it because Mama said we earn our keep. She slid the ledger across the table toward him. File the payment, Mr. Boone. Today, if you can. Yea. He rode to Guthrie that afternoon. He told Clara he had an errand he'd neglected and would be back by supper. He didn't tell her why. That was a mistake, and he would understand later why it mattered. But in the moment, it seemed simpler to go and come back and say nothing, the way he had handled most things in the last 3 years. He made the payment at the land office. He filed the necessary paperwork. The clerk behind the counter looked at the date on the documents and gave him a look that said he understood how close it had been. He was walking back to his horse when he heard his name. Boone. He turned. Silas Crow was standing across the street in front of the general store, and he was not alone. 2 men flanked him, the kind of men who stand slightly behind a person to indicate they belong to him. Crow himself was a compact, carefully dressed man in his mid-40s, with a neat gray mustache, and the kind of eyes that were always slightly more amused than the situation called for. Crow, Elias said, I heard you had some visitors out at your ranch. Crow crossed the street without hurrying, his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets. He stopped 6 feet away and looked at Elias the way a man looks at a chess piece he's thinking about moving. Widow woman and some children. That right? What I have on my land is my own business. Sure it is, Crow said. Just making conversation? He smiled, and the smile did not reach those eyes at all. Just strange timing is all. You've been out there alone for 3 years, and then all of a sudden a woman shows up. People talk. People can talk all they want. They can, Crow agreed. And they will. You know how this territory is, Elias. A man of your standing having a woman living in his house. A widow woman no less, with no husband, no home, no money to speak of. People start to wonder about the nature of the arrangement. Elias looked at him for a long, steady moment. You're a careful man with words, Crow. I'll give you that. I try to be. Say what you mean. Crow's smile stayed exactly where it was. I'm saying that if you were to sell me the North Pasture and the Dry Creek rights reasonable price fair terms, I could make sure the conversation around town stays respectful, for her sake. He tilted his head slightly. A widow woman's reputation is a fragile thing. Seems like the charitable thing would be to protect it. Elias felt the particular cold that comes not from temperature, but from the understanding that someone is willing to hurt an innocent person to get what they want. Get off my street, he said. Crow raised both hands in a gesture of innocence. Just a thought, Elias, a friendly suggestion. Think on it. He turned and walked back toward the general store, his two men turning with him like shadows. At the door he paused. Give my regards to your guests, he said, and went inside. Elias stood in the street for a long moment. He thought about Clara saying someone always does the flat certainty of a woman who had been caught in this machinery before. He thought about Abby with the kitchen knife in her apron. He thought about how Clara had said we'll leave before it becomes a problem, like she had already learned that her presence made things harder for people, and had simply accepted it as a permanent condition of her life. He rode home fast. Yeah, he didn't tell her that night either, and that was the second mistake. He told himself he needed to think first, needed to figure out how to say it without frightening her, needed to understand the full shape of what Crow was doing before he brought it to her door. These were all reasonable justifications, and they were all wrong. Clara Whitmore had spent 3 months making hard decisions alone and had not broken yet. She did not need protection from information. She needed a straight line, but he didn't know that yet. He would learn it. Supper that night was louder than the first one. Annie had found a collection of smooth river stones somewhere and arranged them into what she called a town, and she narrated its politics in elaborate detail throughout the meal in a way that had Grace correcting her facts, and Lydia ignoring her entirely, and Abby telling her twice to eat her food. This stone here is the mayor, Annie explained, walking a pebble across the table. And this one is the bad man, and the mayor is going to, Annie, Abby said, going to make the bad man leave, Annie eat. Because in my town, bad men have to leave. Annie looked up at Elias with complete seriousness. That's the rule. Seems like a good rule, Elias said. Do you have bad men here? The table got quieter. Clara was watching him. He met her eyes for half a second and then looked at Annie. Every place has its share, he said. What do you do with them? Deal with them as they come, he said, one at a time. Annie considered this gravely, then walked her mayor stone over the bad man stone in a way that suggested a decisive resolution and went back to eating her beans. Under the table, Clara's hand moved. She set it on the table, palm up, not toward him, just open. It was not an offer. It was more like a statement. He looked at it and looked away and said nothing, but he thought about it for a long time after. Dear, 3 days became a week. Nobody planned it that way. The axle repair took longer than Elias had estimated. He had to ride to the next town for an additional iron band. And then the fitting took 2 full days because the split in the wood was deeper than he'd originally thought. By the time it was done, Lydia had named the bay mare Clover and was riding her in the south pasture every morning. By the time it was done, Grace had read through half of Elias's small collection of books and left careful little notes in the margins in pencil, not defacing them, just leaving traces of her mind alongside the author's, which was so entirely her that Clara could only shake her head. By the time it was done, Annie had personally introduced herself to every animal on the ranch and given most of them names that Elias had not agreed to, but found himself using anyway. By the time it was done, Clara had organized the pantry, repaired 3 fence rails on the east side of the property, re-sewn the curtains in the kitchen, planted a second row of late-season beans in the garden, and updated the household ledger with Abby's help so that Elias could see at a glance where his money was and where it was going. She had made herself necessary. She hadn't meant to. It had simply happened the way it always happened with Clara. She walked into a problem and started solving it, and by the time she noticed what she'd done, it was already done. On the 7th evening after the girls were in bed, she sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee, and Elias came out and sat 2 steps above her, and they were both quiet for a while in the way they had gotten quiet together, not uncomfortable, just easy. "The axle's done," she said. "Yes. We should leave in the morning." He didn't answer right away. "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't have much to do with it," she said. "What's practical is what matters. What's practical about putting 4 girls back on a road with an axle that's been braced rather than replaced? What's practical about staying in a man's house indefinitely with no arrangement? We could make an arrangement," he said. She turned and looked at him over her shoulder. "A proper one," he said quickly. "Work for room and board. Your girls are doing the work of 3 hired hands already. Abby's better with the books than I am. Lydia's better with the mare than I was. And the garden, Clara. I haven't had a working garden since Margaret—" He stopped. She turned back to face the yard. "I'm not asking anything improper," he said. "I'm asking you to stay on because you're useful and because—" He stopped again. "Because what?" she said quietly. He was quiet for a long moment. The summer crickets were very loud. "Because the house doesn't feel like a tomb when you're in it," he said finally. And it did before. Clara held her coffee cup with both hands and looked at the dark yard and felt the ground shift slightly under her in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. She recognized this feeling. She had felt it before long ago when Thomas had stood in the rain outside her father's house and looked at her like she was the only fixed point in a turning world. She had let herself be known then, and it had led to the best years of her life, and then to the worst morning of her life, standing at a graveside with 43 cents and 4 daughters, and nothing else. "I'm afraid of this," she said. It came out before she could organize it into something more controlled. "So am I," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her steadily, without performance or pretense, and she thought that the bravest thing she had seen in a long time was a man saying, "So am I," without flinching. "1 month," she said. "Work for room and board. Proper arrangement, nothing improper spoken or implied." "Agreed. And if at the end of 1 month it isn't working, we leave, and there are no hard feelings." "Agreed." She looked at him for another moment. "And Abby is in charge of the ledger." Something that was almost a smile. "I had already assumed that." She did not know about Silas Crow yet. She would find out, but not from Elias, from Mrs. Ruth Harlan, who drove her wagon out from town on a Tuesday morning with a crate of preserves and a look on her face that said she had come to say something she thought needed saying. Ruth Harlan was 60 years old and had been widowed twice, which in her own words had given her a very clear view of which hills were worth dying on. She was large and unhurried and had a voice that could carry across a pasture. She had been one of the original settlers in this part of Oklahoma Territory, and she knew everyone and everything, and more importantly, she had spent decades watching the world turn and had formed opinions about it that she was not shy about sharing. She found Clara in the garden and set the preserves down and looked at her for a moment with those sharp, measuring eyes. "You're the widow Whitmore," she said. "Yes, ma'am?" "I'm Ruth Harlan. I live about 4 miles east." She settled herself on the garden fence with the ease of a woman who has been climbing fences her whole life. "I came to tell you something that Elias Boone should have already told you but probably hasn't, because that man would rather fix a fence post alone in a rainstorm than ask someone for help." Clara straightened and brushed the dirt from her hands. "What is it?" "Silas Crow has been in town 3 days running talking about you." The garden was very still. "What has he been saying?" Clara asked. Her voice was level. She had learned to keep her voice level. "Nothing direct," Ruth said. "He's too clever for that. It's questions. Has anyone met the widow woman staying out at Boone's place? What do we know about her people? Is it true she came in on a broken wagon? Questions with a particular tone you understand, the kind that make people start supplying their own answers. And what answers are they supplying? Clara said. Ruth looked at her with direct, kind eyes. Nothing too bad yet, but the wind shifts fast in a small town. I've seen a woman's name go from respectable to ruined in the space of a church social. Clara pressed her lips together. She had known this was coming. She had said as much to Elias the first morning. Someone always does. Why is he doing it? She asked. Because Elias Boone has water rights that Silas Crow has wanted for 10 years, and for 10 years, Elias has been steady enough that there was no lever to use against him. Ruth looked out over the pasture. And then you arrived, and Crow sees a lever. Clara stood in the dirt and felt the familiar weight of it, the weight of being the thing that makes a situation complicated. She had carried that weight in Kansas when Thomas died. She had carried it on the road. She was carrying it here. I need to tell Elias, she said. He already knows, Ruth said. Crow told him directly in Guthrie a week ago. The word hit her like cold water. He already knows. He does. And he didn't tell me. Ruth's expression was not unkind. He's trying to protect you, she said, in the way that men do, which is to carry the thing themselves and say nothing, and then wonder why the person they're protecting doesn't feel safe. Clara pulled off her garden gloves. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she was furious at them for it. He should have told me, she said. Yes, Ruth agreed. He should have. I am not a child. I am not a person who needs to be managed. No, Ruth said. You are not. I have been making hard decisions alone for 3 months, and I have not— She stopped herself, breathed. I need to speak to him. He's in the barn, Ruth said. I'll stay with the girls. She found him replacing boards on the interior stall wall, working with a measured rhythmic swing of the hammer that she could hear before she even pushed the barn door open. She came through the door and stopped, and he turned at the sound of her and read her face in 1 second and set the hammer down. Clara. You knew, she said. You knew about Crow and what he's been saying in town, and you didn't tell me. He didn't deny it. I was trying to handle it. By yourself. Yes, without telling me what was being said about me, in my name, about my reputation. Her voice was quiet, and it was the kind of quiet that had iron in it. Mr. Boone, I need you to understand something. The thing that men do where they carry the hard information alone because they think that protects us, it does not protect us. It leaves us standing in the middle of a situation we don't understand, with no way to defend ourselves, and that is a far more dangerous place to be than simply knowing the truth. He stood there and took that. He didn't argue it. He didn't justify himself further. He just stood there and listened, which was the right thing to do, and some part of Clara recognized it, even through her anger. What exactly did Crow say to you? She said. He told her. All of it, the street in Guthrie, the carefully worded threat, the offer about the water rights, and the north pasture. He told it straight through without softening it. When he finished, Clara was quiet for a moment. He'll use us to take your land, she said. He'll try? Then we should leave. She said it without drama, just fact. If we leave, he has no lever. If you leave, he wins, Elias said. He drives you off the first place you've had shelter in 3 months, and he takes my creek, because I went back to not paying attention. He picked the hammer up from the nail where he'd hung it. He wasn't going back to work, it was something to do with his hands. I don't want you to leave, Clara. I want you to stay, and I want to fight him together. But I should have told you, and I'm sorry I didn't. She looked at him for a long moment. Don't do it again, she said. Whatever is happening on this land that concerns me, I need to know it. I am your partner in this arrangement, or I am nothing, and I will not be nothing again. He held her gaze. Understood, he said. She crossed her arms over her chest, the anger settling into something cooler and more manageable. Then we need a plan. Abby has already flagged the water assessment. You filed it, filed and paid. Good. Then Crow can't move on that angle. He's left with gossip. She thought for a moment. Gossip dies when it stops being interesting. The most boring thing we can be is exactly what we are, a widow woman, and her daughters doing legitimate work for room and board under a respectable arrangement. She looked at him. Is there anyone in town who can vouch for that, whose word carries weight? Ruth Harlan, he said immediately. She's already here. She told me. He almost smiled. Of course she did. She's going to be important, Clara said. She's been here from the beginning and people trust her. We need to be seen in town acting normal and respectable, and we need Ruth Harlan's visible approval. She paused. I'll go to church on Sunday. I don't generally. I know you don't, she said. You're going this Sunday. He looked at her. She looked at him. He put the hammer down on the stall rail. Yes, ma'am, he said. It was the first time he'd called her ma'am and meant it as something other than polite distance. It landed differently, and they both felt it. She turned and walked back toward the barn door. At the door she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. And Elias? She said the first time she had used his given name, and it came out without calculation, just naturally, the way things come out when the pretense has been burned off. He looked at her. Next time tell me, she said. I'm harder than I look. I know that, he said. I knew that the first day. She went back out into the summer heat, and behind her in the barn, Elias Boone stood holding a hammer he wasn't using, and thought about the word partner, and the way she had said it, not as a soft thing, not as a compromise, but like a fact she had decided, a fact she was going to hold to. He picked up the hammer and went back to work, and for the first time in 3 years, the sound of it in the empty barn didn't feel like the sound of a man keeping busy to avoid his own silence. It felt like the sound of someone building toward something. He just didn't know yet what Silas Crow had already decided to take from him to make sure that something never got built, but he was about to find out. Sunday came, and they went to church. Clara pressed the girls' dresses the night before with a flat iron she found hanging on a nail in the kitchen, working by lamplight while the house slept. She had one good dress left, dark blue, worn at the elbows but clean. She put it on in the dark before anyone was awake, and stood in front of the small mirror in the bedroom, and did what she always did before walking into a room that was going to judge her. She looked at herself straight on. She let the fear come all the way up. And then she put it somewhere it couldn't reach her face. Elias wore a clean shirt and his good hat and said nothing about it. They rode into Guthrie in the wagon, all 6 of them, which Clara understood was itself a statement. She sat beside Elias on the bench, and the girls rode in the back, and Annie asked every 3 minutes if they were almost there, and Grace read her Bible, and Lydia sat facing backward, watching the road they'd come from, with her usual animal alertness, and Abby sat very straight and said nothing, and watched the town come up on the horizon, like something she was prepared to fight. They were not the first to arrive at the church. They were not meant to be. Clara had thought about this. She wanted people already inside when they walked in, wanted to walk through a room already full, rather than sit and wait to be assessed. She told Elias this, and he had nodded without question, which she noted. The look started before they reached the door. She felt them the way you feel, whether before it arrives, not from any one person, just a general shift in the atmosphere, a slight change in the quality of the attention around her. 2 women near the steps stopped talking when they saw the wagon. A man near the door tipped his hat to Elias and then let his eyes move to Clara in a way that was not quite rude and not quite respectful, and occupied the uncomfortable middle ground. Clara walked through the door with Annie's hand in hers, and her chin level, and her eyes straight ahead. Ruth Harlan was waiting in the 3rd row from the front. She had saved space. She caught Clara's eye and gave a single deliberate nod, the nod of a general confirming a strategy. Clara steered her daughters into the row, and Ruth shook each girl's hand like they were adults, and told Elias Boone he looked better than he had in 3 years, which made a woman behind them laugh, and the laugh broke some of the tension in the air. The way a window opened breaks a close room. By the time the service started, Clara's shoulders had come down half an inch. By the time it ended, 3 women had introduced themselves, and 2 of them had invited Clara to a quilting circle on Wednesdays. One of them, a Mrs. Aldridge, red-haired and plain-spoken, had leaned over during the final hymn and said quietly, "Don't you mind Silas Crow? He tried the same thing with the Hendersons 2 years ago, and Ruth Harlan put a stop to it. She'll put a stop to it again." Clara had not responded, but she had felt something ease inside her chest that had been tight for days. Silas Crow was not at the service. She had half expected him to be. The fact that he wasn't told her something he preferred to work in spaces where he controlled the audience. Church in Guthrie was Ruth Harlan's territory, and he knew it. On the ride back, Annie fell asleep against Elias's arm before they'd gone 2 miles. He adjusted his grip on the reins one-handed without comment. Clara watched him do it out of the corner of her eye and said nothing, but she thought about it. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Clara had not let herself expect. Not comfort. Exactly comfort was a thing she had put away after Thomas, the way you put away fine dishes when you're traveling. But something like function. Something like purpose. Something that might, if she let herself look at it directly, be the beginning of what came after grief. Elias worked the cattle. Lydia worked the horse. Abby worked the numbers. Grace worked the books and the garden in equal measure. Annie worked the general project of being Annie, which turned out to be more valuable than it sounded. She had a gift for walking into a tense room and making people forget what they were. Tense about, which Clara was beginning to think was a skill as useful as any other. And Clara worked everything. She worked the kitchen and the garden and the mending and the accounts and the fence repairs and the business of managing a household with the focused competence of a woman who had spent her entire adult life making limited resources stretch further than they were supposed to go. She had a talent for it. Thomas had always said she could run a small country on a shoestring and make it profitable. Elias noticed. He didn't say much about it directly. He was not a man who came to compliments easily, but she caught it in other ways. The way he started leaving decisions to her without being asked. The way he stopped prefacing things with "if it's all right with you," and started just asking her opinion, as though it mattered, which it turned out it did, and they both gradually accepted that without making a production of it. One evening, she came in from the garden to find him at the kitchen table, with the ledger open, and a look on his face, like a man who had just found something he didn't understand. She washed her hands at the basin, and came to look over his shoulder. "You balanced it differently," he said. "I reorganized the categories. The way you had it, you couldn't see where the money was actually going." "I can see it fine. You thought you could see it. There's a difference." She pointed at a column. "This is your feed cost. For the last 2 years, you've been underestimating it by about $30 a season because you were mixing it in with the general supply costs. That's why you always felt short at the end of winter." He looked at the column for a long moment. "Huh," he said. "Abby found it." "Of course she did. She also found that you've been overpaying your hand deacon by about $4 a month because the original agreement was written in pencil, and someone she thinks you changed a number at some point and forgot." Elias rubbed the back of his neck. "I gave him a raise. Then I forgot to write the new number in ink." "That is the least surprising thing you have ever told me," Clara said. He looked up at her, and she realized they were standing very close. She had leaned over to point at the column and stayed there, and they were close enough that she could see the gray coming in at his temples and the particular expression on his face of a man who is looking at something and trying very hard to look at the ledger instead. She straightened and moved back to the other side of the table. "I'll have Abby write the corrected numbers in ink tomorrow," she said. "Yes," he said. "Good." They were both very focused on the ledger for the next several minutes. 3 weeks after the church Sunday, Silas Crow made his next move. It didn't come from him directly. That was never how it came. It came through a man named Porter, who worked for the Territorial Cattlemen's Association, and who rode out to the ranch on a Thursday morning while Elias was in the south pasture. He asked for Mr. Boone. He got Clara instead. "He's out with the cattle," Clara said from the porch. "What's your business?" Porter was a thin man with a nervous habit of touching the brim of his hat. He touched it twice before he spoke. "Ma'am, I'm here on behalf of the association regarding a complaint filed against the Boone Ranch concerning the water quality at Dry Creek. There's been a formal allegation that the upstream management is causing contamination affecting neighboring cattle operations." Clara kept her face completely neutral. "What neighboring operation?" "Crowland and cattle, ma'am." She looked at Porter for a long, steady moment. Porter touched his hat again. "Can I ask who filed this complaint and when?" she said. "Mr. Crow filed it 9 days ago. The association is required to investigate all formal complaints within 30 days. And what does an investigation involve? An inspector would need access to the creek and the upstream water sources. And Mr. Boone would need to appear before the association board in Guthrie within the next 2 weeks to respond to the allegations." "I see." She folded her hands in front of her. "Mr. Porter, is there anything in the association's charter that prevents a ranch from filing a counter-complaint against a party who files false allegations?" Porter blinked. "Ma'am, it's a straightforward question. If a party files a complaint knowing it to be false, can the aggrieved party file a counter-complaint with the association board?" Yes, technically, there is such a provision." "Good. You can tell Mr. Crow that Mr. Boone will appear before the board, and that we will be bringing documentation of a pattern of bad faith legal and financial pressure going back at least a year." She smiled at Porter with the particular warmth of a woman who has made up her mind. "Would you like some coffee before you ride back?" Porter touched his hat a third time. "No, thank you, ma'am." He turned his horse and left considerably faster than he had arrived. Clara went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed for a moment. Then she picked up the ledger and the file of documents Abby had organized and started making a list. She told Elias that evening, all of it, every word of the conversation with Porter, because she had promised and she intended to keep it. He sat across the table and listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You told him we'd file a counter-complaint," he said. "Yes." "Do we have enough documentation?" Abby's been keeping track of everything since the first week. The original letter, the Guthrie encounter, the water assessment filing with dates, the land office paperwork. It's not a complete case, but it's enough to show a pattern. She paused. "Ruth Harlan will testify to his history in the territory. She told me so last Wednesday." Elias sat back and looked at her. "You've been building this for 2 weeks, he said. "Since the day I found out," she said. "Did you think I was going to wait for him to come at us again?" "No," he said. "I didn't think that." "Good." He looked at the papers in front of her. He looked at her. Something was moving across his face that she had seen before, that same expression from the first morning, the one she hadn't had a name for yet. "Clara," he said. "Yes. I want to say something, and I want you to let me finish before you respond." She set her pencil down. "All right. When you leave here, whenever that is, at the end of the month or the end of the year, or whenever you decide, I want you to know that the 6 weeks you've been here have been—" He stopped. Started again. "I don't have the right words for it. I've been trying to find the right words for about a week, and I don't have them. So, I'll say it plain, I haven't felt like a person with a future in 3 years. I felt like a man maintaining a property. And now, I don't feel that way, and I think you know why, and I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know." The kitchen was very still. Clara sat with his words and did not immediately put them away, the way she usually put things that frightened her. She let them stay. She thought about Thomas, the way she always did, when something reached the part of her she kept locked, and she did not feel, as she had feared, that allowing this feeling meant forgetting him. She felt instead that he would have liked Elias Boone, that he would have trusted him in about the same time she had. "I know," she said, "and I want you to know that I'm not ready to name what I feel yet. I don't know that I have the right. But it isn't nothing, Elias. Whatever it isn't nothing." He nodded once, slow and deliberate, like a man receiving news he'd hoped for but hadn't counted on. "That's enough for now. he said. "That's all I can give right now," she said. "It's enough," he said again, and meant it. The fire started on a Thursday night. Nobody saw it coming, which was the thing about summer lightning in Oklahoma. It announced itself with violence and no warning. The storm came up from the southwest after dark, the kind that moves fast and hits hard and is already on top of you before the air has finished smelling like rain. Elias was on the porch when the first bolt came down. He was on his feet before the thunder finished because he knew this land, and he knew what a summer strike in dry grass meant, and Dry Creek pasture was the driest part of the whole ranch. He went straight to the barn. Clara heard the door and came out of the kitchen and saw him moving fast. "What is it?" "Lightning strikes south of the creek. I can smell it." He was already pulling on his coat, reaching for the lantern. "Wake the girls and get them inside. Don't let anyone out of the house." "How bad?" "Could be nothing. Could be bad." He looked at her. "Stay inside, Clara." He rode out. He should have known that telling anyone in the Whitmore family to stay somewhere was not the same as them staying. Lydia heard the horse leave and was out of bed in 60 seconds. She had been sleeping light. She always slept light when weather was coming, the same way Clover did, some animal alertness that never quite shut off. She went to the window and saw the glow to the south. Not lightning, the other kind of glow. She was pulling on her boots before Clara came through the door. "Lydia." "I can help," Lydia said. "I can ride Clover. She trusts me." "Absolutely not. Mama." Lydia stood up and looked at her mother with those steady, serious eyes, the eyes of a girl who had been born 10 years old, Clara had always privately thought. "Clover won't let anyone else ride her, and if the herd scatters toward the fire, he'll need someone who can cut them back." She picked up her hat. "He can't do it alone." Clara stood in the doorway and felt every instinct she had pulling in two directions simultaneously. "Stay behind the creek line," she said. "The moment it gets close, you come back." "Yes, ma'am." "Lydia." Her daughter was already through the door. Clara turned back to the room. Grace was sitting up in bed with wide eyes and the Bible already in her hands. Abby was standing fully dressed, her hair loose, looking at Clara with an expression that said she was already calculating what needed to happen next. "Where's Annie?" Clara said. The room went quiet. 3 seconds passed that lasted a year. "She was right here," Grace said. "She was right." She looked at the empty space in the bed beside her. The covers were pushed back. The little pair of boots that lived beside the bed were gone. Clara said her daughter's name once. Then she was running. Annie had followed Elias. Not right away. She had woken up when the barn door slammed and watched from the window as he rode south, and she had thought what she always thought when she saw him moving fast and alone, which was that he needed someone to come with him, because riding into things alone was no way to do anything. She had said this to Grace once, and Grace had told her that was not her job, and Annie had considered that and decided Grace was wrong. She could not ride, but she knew the path to Dry Creek because she had walked it 4 times with Lydia, and she knew it went straight south from the barn gate and then bent left at the big split-trunk oak that she had named Gerald. She was past Gerald and most of the way to the creek before the smoke reached her. She stopped. The smoke was thick and low, and it tasted like something wrong. And ahead of her, through the dark and the haze, she could see the fire. Orange and rolling the way fire looks when it has gotten into the grass and decided to go somewhere. Annie was 5 years old. She was not afraid of very many things. But she stopped walking. She looked for Elias. She could not see him. She could hear the cattle, that specific panicked sound that was different from any other sound they made, and she could hear hoofbeats and someone shouting. But the smoke was too thick now, and the shapes in it were too unclear, and she was not. She realized as good at finding people in the dark as she had thought. She took 2 steps backward. Her boot caught on a root, and she sat down hard in the dirt. She got up. The smoke was getting thicker. She turned to go back the way she came, but the path through the grass looked different from this direction, and the smoke made the dark darker, and she turned twice and wasn't sure which way was Gerald. Elias, she called. Her voice came out small. No answer. Elias. Clara heard her. She had run straight south from the house without a lantern, which she knew was foolish, but she could see the fire glow, and she had been running toward it before she'd thought clearly enough to go back for one. She was 200 yards from the creek when she heard Annie's voice cutting through the smoke, high and thin, and unmistakably her youngest daughter. She did not think. She ran toward the sound. Annie! She put everything she had into her voice. Annie, answer me. Mama? Much closer than she expected. Mama, I can't find Gerald. Who is? It didn't matter. Keep talking to me, baby. Keep talking. I'm talking, I'm right here. The smoke is very bad, Mama. I don't like it. Clara found her. Almost ran over her. Annie was crouched behind a fallen cottonwood. A big old white-limbed trunk that had come down in some previous storm and half-blocked the path. She had apparently tripped over it, trying to go back. Clara grabbed her up, all of her 35 pounds of 5-year-old, and held her against her chest. I've got you, she said. I've got you. I was trying to help, Annie said into her shoulder. Her voice was completely steady, which was somehow worse than crying. I know you were. He was alone. I know. The fire was louder now. Clara could feel the heat of it from this distance, that particular pressing heat that has direction that comes at you. She turned for the house, and the smoke shifted, and she couldn't see the path, and she turned again. The fallen cottonwood was in the way. She couldn't remember which side she'd come from. Clara. She turned at the sound of his voice. Elias came out of the smoke on foot, not on the horse, which meant the horse had gone somewhere, and she didn't have time to ask. He was covered in ash, and his coat had a scorched place on the shoulder, and he was moving fast. He reached them, and his hands went to Annie first, both of Annie checking her, the way you check an animal for injury, fast and thorough, and then his hands went to Clara's arms. Are you hurt? He said. No, she's not hurt. She came. I know. I saw her from across the creek. Something was in his voice that wasn't anger and wasn't quite fear. It was the thing that lives on the other side of both. The herd's scattered east. Deacon and the boys are cutting them back. But the barn... A sound hit them from the north, even through the smoke and the noise of the fire it carried. The specific groan and crack of timber losing its argument with fire. Elias turned toward it. His jaw was tight. The barn, Clara said. Yes. He said it like a man absorbing a blow and staying upright. The north wall was already dry. Lightning probably hit the... He stopped. It doesn't matter. Elias. It doesn't matter right now. He took Annie from Clara's arms without asking, which Clara did not object to, and tucked the child against his side with a practiced ease that suggested he had been carrying small things against his side all his life, and had forgotten until now. He took Clara's hand with his other hand. This way, he said. Stay close. Nick. They came up out of the creek hollow and found Abby standing on the ridge above them with a lantern in each hand held high, and Grace on one side of her, holding a third lantern, and Lydia on Clover's back on the other side, and Mrs. Ruth Harlan, who had apparently heard the commotion from 4 miles away, and driven her wagon through the dark like a woman who had seen enough things in 60 years, not to be stopped by smoke standing behind them all with a fourth lantern, and a look on her face that said she was deeply annoyed, and also deeply relieved, and would address both of these things shortly. Elias stopped when he saw them, all 4 of his lanterns held by 4 people who had come into the smoke to find him. The creek path goes left, Abby called down. We could see you from here. You needed to go left. So I did, Elias said. Ruth brought her wagon. It's at the top. Good. They came up the ridge, and Ruth Harlan looked at Annie, and then looked at Clara with a particular expression that said several things at once without using any words. Clara met it and gave a small nod that meant, yes, I know, and later, and Ruth accepted this. Barn's gone, Ruth said. Not unkindly, just straight. I know, Elias said. The cattle. East pasture. Deacon's got them. Water rights fence. He paused. I don't know. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Crow's men were seen riding the South Pasture Road this afternoon, before the storm. She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. 2 of them, carrying wire cutters. Elias was very still. That's why the herd scattered toward the fire, Clara said. It came out quiet and certain. The east fence line, someone cut it. That would be my thinking, Ruth said. You can't prove that, Lydia said from Clover's back. Not yet, Clara said. But we know, and knowing is the beginning of proving. Elias set Annie down. She immediately grabbed his hand and held it with both of hers, which she did when she was done being brave for a while. He looked at Clara across the top of Annie's head, and she looked back at him, and there was a full conversation in that look that neither of them could have spoken aloud, but both of them understood completely. He had chosen them. When the fire was at the fence line and the herd was running, and every practical instinct told him to stay with the cattle, he had come into the smoke for a 5-year-old girl and a woman who had told him she wasn't ready to name things yet. He had chosen them, and he had lost the barn and part of the herd, and she did not know how to carry that. They came back to the house to find the kitchen undamaged and the fire burned down to the creek line where the water had stopped it. Deacon and the ranch hands came in after midnight with most of the herd, not all of it, but most. Enough. Elias sat on the porch steps while Clara heated water and made coffee she knew nobody would sleep enough to need. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them and looked at the dark where the barn used to be. She came out with 2 cups and sat beside him on the steps. He didn't speak for a while. She didn't push. I had that barn built the same year I built the house, he said finally. Margaret picked out the wood. She wanted red paint. I never got around to the paint. He paused. I thought after she died that I should paint it, for her. I never did that either. Elias. I keep a long list of things I didn't do, he said. It's not a useful thing to keep. No, she agreed. I went back for you, he said. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't that I forgot the cattle. I knew what I was doing. I know you did. I need you to know I don't regret it. Elias, I need to say this. He turned and looked at her, and his voice was the quietest she had ever heard it, which somehow made it carry more weight, not less. Before you came, this ranch was all I had left in the world. It was the whole thing. And I was managing it, keeping it exactly the way it was, because that was the only thing I knew how to do with grief. Just keep everything exactly in place, and don't let anything change. He looked at his hands. You changed everything. All 5 of you. In 6 weeks, you made this place. He stopped. I didn't know it was possible to miss a thing you never had. And then I had it. And I'm not willing to go back. Clara was quiet for a moment. Her coffee cup was warm in her hands, and the summer night around them smelled like smoke and grass and the particular clean smell of air after lightning. I spent 3 months on that road, she said, telling myself that the next town would be better, the next chance, the next thing. Telling myself I just had to get the girls somewhere safe, and then I could stop holding everything together. She paused. And then the axle broke. And then the axle broke, he said. And you rode up, she said. And I thought, here is a man about to tell me to get off his land. And instead you said, 5 reasons, he said. 5 reasons. She looked at him. I've been afraid since the first morning, not of you, of this, of being... She stopped. I don't want to want something I can lose again. I know, he said. I've been afraid of the same thing. How do you live with it? He looked at her directly. I reckon you stop making decisions based on what you're afraid to lose, he said. And you start making them based on what you can't bear to walk away from. The air between them was very still. I can't bear to walk away from this, she said. The words came out simple and true, the way the most important words always do, without ceremony, without qualification. Just the plain shape of them. "Neither can I," he said. He did not take her hand. He did not move toward her. He just sat there beside her in the dark, with his ash-covered coat, and his lost barn, and his scattered cattle, and looked at her, and she looked at him. And it was one of those moments that isn't dramatic from the outside, just two people sitting on porch steps with coffee. But that is entirely different from the inside, because inside it is the moment when something that has been building for weeks arrives at last and sits down and says, "Here I am." "Silas Crow did this," she said after a while. "He tried to break me," Elias said. "He thinks I'm broken." "Are you?" "No." "Good." She stood up and brushed the ash from her skirt. "Because tomorrow morning, I need you to ride into Guthrie with me, and we are going to walk into the land office and every office that matters in that town, and we are going to tell every person who will listen exactly what Silas Crow has been doing." She looked down at him. "He came at us through gossip, through legal filings, through the Cattlemen's Association, and now through a fence line and a fire. He's out of subtle, which means we're out of time for careful." Elias looked up at her. "You have a plan." "Abby and I have been building one for 2 weeks. He stood up. They were standing very close on the narrow porch, and neither of them moved back. "Clara," he said. "Yes. When this is over." He stopped. Started again. "I want to ask you something. When this is over and things are steadier, I want to ask you something important." She looked at him for a long moment. "Ask me when it's over," she said. "I'll be ready to answer." It was not a yes, but it was not a no, and both of them knew, with the absolute certainty that comes after going through fire together, that it was the most honest thing she could give him in that moment. It was enough. Inside the house, through the window, Annie's voice drifted out. She was awake again, telling Grace about Gerald the oak tree, with the complete absence of self-consciousness of a child who has been frightened and has now returned to being Annie. Grace's lower murmur answered. And then Abby's voice, quieter and more surprising, not shushing them, just talking the voice of a girl who for one night had let herself be 13 years old, holding a lantern on a ridge in the dark, for a man she had not yet decided to trust. That night, in a house that smelled like smoke and coffee, and something that was slowly becoming a family. Silas Crow sat in his office in Guthrie and looked at the report his men had brought him, and smiled. He believed the fire had broken Elias Boone. He believed the barn, the cattle, the financial pressure, and the gossip had added up to a man with nothing left to stand on. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. But he would not know that until morning. They rode into Guthrie before the ash had cooled. Clara had been up since 4 in the morning, not because she couldn't sleep, but because sleeping felt like a waste of the hours. She sat at the kitchen table with Abby, and the two of them went through every document in the file. The water assessment paperwork, the land office filing, Crow's legal notice, the dates of every interaction Elias had documented in the ledger margins, the note Ruth Harlan had written in her firm, broad hand about the 2 men with wire cutters on the South Pasture Road. They organized it the way Clara's father had taught her to organize an argument chronologically, with the clearest facts first and the most damning facts last. Abby did not speak much during this. She worked. She had her mother's way of concentrating total quiet, with a slight crease between her brows that meant she was running every possibility through her head simultaneously. At one point, she looked up and said, "The Cattlemen's Association complaint is the weakest piece for Crow because he filed it before the fire. If we can show the fire was deliberate, the complaint becomes evidence of a pattern rather than a separate grievance." Clara looked at her daughter. "How do you know that?" Daddy explained how legal arguments work once. He said the shape of the evidence matters as much as the evidence itself. She looked back at the papers. "This shape says Crow was trying to break Elias by 1,000 small cuts. The fire was just the cut that went too deep." "That's exactly right," Clara said. Abby kept her eyes on the papers. "Are we going to be okay, Mama? All of us? Are we going to be okay here?" Clara put her hand flat on the table between them. Abby looked at it and then put her own hand over it briefly, The way she did most tender things quickly and without ceremony, as though she could take it back if it didn't land right. "Yes," Clara said. "We are going to be okay." Abby took her hand back and picked up her pencil. "Then let's finish this." Elias knocked on the kitchen door frame at 5:30. He looked like a man who had also not slept, but who had spent his sleepless hours doing something physical to manage it. There was fresh sawdust on his boots, and his hands were roughed from work. He looked at the table covered in organized papers, and at Clara and Abby sitting across from each other like two generals before a campaign, and he said nothing for a moment. "Coffee's on the stove," Clara said. He poured himself a cup and came to stand at the end of the table and look at what they had assembled. He was quiet for a long time reading through it. Then he set the cup down. "This is everything," he said. "Almost," Abby said. She did not look up. "We need one more thing. We need you to tell us everything Crow said to you in Guthrie that day. Every word." Elias pulled out the bench and sat down. He told it again, the way Clara had asked him to tell her straight through without softening. Abby wrote as he spoke, her handwriting small and precise. When he finished, she looked at what she'd written and said, "He used the word arrangement when he talked about you and Mama." "Yes, that's important. He wasn't just threatening your land. He was threatening her specifically, her name, her character." She tapped the page. "That's not a business dispute. That's targeted harm against a specific person. The association board won't like that, and neither will anyone at that church who watched Ruth Harlan shake Mama's hand." Elias looked across the table at Clara. "She's remarkable," he said. "Don't tell her that," Clara said. "Her head's already the right size." "I can hear you both," Abby said. They left Grace and Annie with Deacon's wife, who had come out at first light when she heard about the fire with a pot of soup and the immediate practical efficiency of a woman who understood that disasters required food first and feelings later. Lydia refused to be left. She climbed into the wagon before anyone told her she could, and sat in the back with her arms crossed and looked at Clara with an expression that made the conversation unnecessary. Clara looked at her for 1 second and said, "You sit quiet in the back, and you let me and Elias do the talking." "Yes, ma'am," Lydia said, immediately, which meant she understood the stakes. Ruth Harlan met them at the edge of town in her wagon. She had brought Mrs. Aldridge, the red-haired woman from the church, and 2 other women whose names Clara was learning, solid women, the kind who had built this territory 1 season at a time. Ruth looked at Clara's face and at the file of papers in Abby's hands, and gave the small, deliberate nod that Clara was beginning to understand was her highest form of approval. "The land office opens at 8, Ruth said. "The association office opens at 8:30. There's a standing community board meeting at the church hall at 10th third Thursday of every month. Today is the 3rd Thursday. Clara looked at her. "You knew the timing." "I've been waiting for the right moment for 2 years, Ruth said. "Silas Crow has been eating this territory one piece at a time. I've been watching for the man willing to stand up and the evidence strong enough to matter." She looked at Elias. "Today we have both." Elias touched his hat brim. "Ruth," he said. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Thank me after." What? They filed at the land office first. The clerk, the same one who had given Elias the knowing look when he'd filed the payment weeks earlier, read the counter-complaint carefully all the way through, while Clara and Elias stood at the counter and waited. He read it twice. Then he stamped it with the kind of definitiveness that meant he had opinions about it. "I'll have this in front of the review officer by this afternoon," he said. He paused. "Between you and me, Mr. Boone, there are 2 other complaints in this office from the last 18 months that have Crow's fingerprints on them. People just didn't have the documentation to do anything about it." He looked at the papers again. "This one does." "Will you tell the other parties?" Clara asked. He looked at her. "That's not really my—" He stopped. "Yes, ma'am. I believe I will." The Cattlemen's Association office was harder. The man behind the desk was named Garrett, and he had the particular careful blankness of someone who has learned to commit to nothing until he knows which way the wind is blowing. He read the counter-filing without expression. He asked 3 questions, all of them procedural. He said the board would review both complaints simultaneously. He did not say when. Clara leaned forward on the counter and said very quietly, "Mr. Garrett, a fire was deliberately set on the Boone property last night. Evidence places 2 of Crow's men at the fence line that afternoon. If the association allows that to sit unremarked while it reviews competing paperwork at its own pace, then the association becomes part of the problem." She held his eyes. "I don't think you want that." Garrett looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Elias. Then he looked at Abby, who was standing slightly behind Clara, with the file in her arms, and the expression of someone who has already read the relevant bylaws. "I'll have a preliminary review scheduled for Monday," he said. "Thank you," Clara said. They walked out into the street. Lydia, who had been waiting outside with the horses, fell into step beside them. "How'd it go?" "Well enough," Elias said. "Did anyone try to be difficult?" "The second man a little." "What did Mama do?" "What she always does," Elias said. He glanced at Clara sideways. Made it clear that being difficult was going to cost more than cooperating. Lydia looked at her mother with the frank admiration she usually reserved for horses. "I want to do that someday," she said. "You already do it," Clara said. "You just do it to mules." Yasi. The community board meeting was where Silas Crow made his mistake. He was there. Clara had not expected that she had expected him to be somewhere else insulated, working his angles from a distance, the way he always did. But he was seated in the 3rd row when they walked in, and he had 2 men with him, and a lawyer she didn't recognize, and he was watching the door with the calm expression of a man who believes he has already won. He had miscalculated where they were going to be, and he had come to get ahead of it, and he had underestimated what they were walking in with. The meeting opened with routine territory business. Clara sat between Elias and Ruth Harlan, and said nothing, and watched Crow with her peripheral vision. He waited, biding his time, building to something. She had seen this before in men who moved through power, the theatrical pause, the moment of maximum damage chosen with precision. He rose during the open comment period. "Board members," he said, and his voice was the practiced voice of a man who had addressed rooms like this many times. "I want to raise a matter of community concern. We have a situation developing at the Boone Ranch that I think deserves open discussion." He looked around the room with the expression of a man deeply reluctant to say a necessary thing. "A woman, a widow, a stranger has been living at Elias Boone's property for going on 7 weeks. I don't question Mr. Boone's charity, but this community has standards. And when those standards are unclear—" "Mr. Crow!" The voice came from behind Clara. Everyone turned. Abby Whitmore was standing up. She was 13 years old. She was wearing a dress that had been mended twice at the hem. Her dark hair was braided, and her hands were at her sides, and she was not shaking, which Clara thought was the most extraordinary thing she had ever witnessed. "Sit down, young lady." Crow said, his voice gentle in the way that is meant to be diminishing. "The adults are—" "My name is Abigail Whitmore," Abby said. Her voice carried. "My mother is Clara Whitmore, and you are talking about her. I think that gives me the right to speak." The room was very still. The board chairman, a gray-haired man named Holland, who Clara had not yet spoken to, looked at Abby, and then at Crow, and then back at Abby. "Go ahead, miss," he said. Crow's jaw tightened. Abby reached into the file. "My mother arrived at the Boone Ranch on July 9th with a broken wagon axle and 4 children. She entered into a formal work arrangement with Mr. Boone Labor in exchange for room and board, which is a standard arrangement in this territory and requires no justification to anyone." She pulled out the first document. "In the 6 weeks since that arrangement began, Silas Crow has made a verbal threat against Mr. Boone's water rights while invoking my mother's reputation as leverage. He filed a bad faith contamination complaint with the Cattlemen's Association. And 2 of his employees were observed carrying wire cutters on the Boone South Pasture Road hours before a fence line was cut, and a fire was set." She set the papers on the table in front of her. "We filed a counter-complaint with the land office this morning. The clerk confirmed 2 prior complaints in that office with Crow's involvement that couldn't move forward for lack of documentation. She looked directly at Crow. "This one has documentation." "Is she?" The silence in the room lasted 4 full seconds. Ruth Harlan rose from her seat. "I can confirm the threat in Guthrie," she said. "I have it in writing from Mr. Boone dated the same day. And I can name 2 other families in this territory who have had similar pressure from Crow land and cattle who may now wish to speak." She sat. And then slowly 2 more people rose. One was a man named Henderson, the same Henderson Mrs. Aldridge had mentioned at the church. He looked at the floor when he started speaking the way a man looks when he's admitting he was too afraid for too long. By the time he finished, he was looking at Crow. Crow's lawyer leaned over and said something in his ear. Crow said something back very low. The lawyer shook his head. Holland, the board chairman, looked at Crow with an expression that had moved well past neutral. "Mr. Crow," he said, "do you have a response to the documentation that has been presented this morning?" Crow stood. He was still composed. Clara gave him that he was a composed man. "These are allegations," he said. "Allegations from a family in difficult circumstances who have a clear interest in—" "The documentation is dated," Abby said. She had not sat down. "All of it is dated before this morning. The complaint we filed today does not create the facts. The facts created the complaint." She sat down. Clara stared at the table in front of her and did not let herself react because if she reacted, she was going to cry, and she was not going to cry in front of Silas Crow. Elias leaned slightly toward her. Just an inch. His arm pressed against hers briefly, and then he was still again. It was enough. The meeting did not end Silas Crow in a single morning. Clara had known it wouldn't, and she had told Abby so on the ride in. Legal and financial power doesn't collapse in one room in 1 hour. What it does is crack. A crack is the beginning of collapse, and a crack was what they left with. Holland announced a formal board review. 3 community members offered to submit written statements. The association representative who had been sitting in the back of the room, who neither Clara nor Elias had seen come in, approached Elias afterward and said the preliminary review had been moved from Monday to Friday. Crow left without speaking to anyone. His lawyer went with him, and his 2 men went after that, and the room was different when they were gone. Not louder exactly, but looser the way a room feels when it's been holding its breath and finally lets it go. Mrs. Aldridge came straight to Clara and took both her hands. "Well," she said, "your girl is something." "I know she is," Clara said. "She's got your backbone." "She's got her father's jaw and her own backbone," Clara said. "I can't take credit for it." Across the room, Abby was being spoken to by Holland and was answering him in the same measured, direct way she answered everything, and Clara watched her and thought about Thomas, who had taught this child to read ledgers and understand legal arguments, and believe that women who understood their own numbers didn't have to depend on anyone else's. She thought about what a good man he had been, and how much she still missed him, and how both of those things could be entirely true at the same time as what she was beginning to feel about Elias Boone. She was learning that grief and hope occupied the same heart without one destroying the other. She was learning it slowly and sometimes painfully, but she was learning it. They drove home in this early afternoon, and the drive was quieter than the drive-in, but a different kind of quiet. The quiet of people who have done something difficult together and are sitting with it. Ruth Harlan drove alongside for the first 2 miles, and then turned east toward her own place, raising one hand as she went. Lydia in the back of the wagon said to no one in particular, "Abby was incredible." "Don't tell her that," Elias said. "Why does everyone keep saying that?" Abby said. "Because your head's already the right size," Lydia said. Abby threw a small piece of straw at her, which was so entirely unlike Abby that both Clara and Elias registered it without saying anything, and Lydia looked very satisfied. When they came up the road to the ranch, Annie was waiting at the fence gate. She had apparently been there for a while, judging by the collection of small rocks she had arranged in a line along the bottom fence rail and the expression on her face of someone who has been extremely patient and is approaching the end of it. "Did you win?" she called out. We made progress, Clara said. Is that the same as winning? It's the beginning of it. Annie considered this. Okay, she said. Deacon's wife made pie. That evening after supper, Elias asked Clara to walk with him to the south pasture. She told the girls to clean up and went. They walked without speaking for a while. The pasture still smelled faintly of smoke. It would for weeks, probably. He stopped at the fence line, the place where the cut wire had been retied by Deacon that morning, and looked out over the grass. I've been thinking about what I want to say to you all day, he said. I had it worked out in my head at 5 this morning. Now I can't find the order of it. Then don't find the order, she said. Just say it. He turned to look at her. I want you to stay. Not as a work arrangement. Not as I want you to stay as my wife. I want your girls to have this land and this house and everything I've spent 11 years building. I want to spend whatever time I've got left building it alongside you. He stopped. I know you're not ready. I know it's too fast and there's too much that's still unsettled, and you told me to ask when things were steadier. But I don't think things get steady, Clara. I think you just decide to stand on shifting ground with someone you trust. And I trust you, completely. So that's what I'm asking. Clara stood very still. The summer evening was long and warm around them. I need to talk to my girls, she said. I know. Abby especially. I know that too. She looked at him. Ask me again tomorrow, she said. Give me tonight. He nodded. Take what you need. She gathered them in the front room after Elias went to the barn. All 4 of them, Annie with her rocks, Grace with her Bible, Lydia cross-legged on the floor, Abby on the bench, with her arms folded and her face already asking the question she hadn't spoken. Clara sat in the chair across from them and folded her hands and looked at her daughters. Elias Boone has asked me to marry him, she said. The room was quiet for 3 seconds. Annie said, I knew it. You didn't know anything, Lydia said. I knew. I told Grace weeks ago. Grace, tell them. She told me weeks ago, Grace confirmed without looking up from the Bible. That's enough, Clara said. She looked at Abby. Abby had not moved or changed expression. Abby, what do you want us to say? Abby said. Her voice was not hostile. It was careful. I want you to say what you feel. Abby was quiet for a moment. I don't know what I feel, she said. I know he's a good man. I know he came into the fire for you and Annie. I know he sat with the ledger all morning and didn't complain once, and he let me speak at that meeting without trying to take over. She pressed her lips together. I know all of that. But, Clara said. But Daddy hasn't been gone a year, Abby said. It came out steady and it came out like a wound at the same time. And this house still has his, it's not Daddy's house. Daddy never saw this house. But you're still his wife. In my head, you're still his wife. And I don't know how to make that fit. Clara stood up and crossed the room and sat next to Abby on the bench and put her arm around her and Abby, who was 13 and who carried kitchen knives and read financial ledgers and had stood up in front of a room full of adults that morning, and not shaken, leaned into her mother and was briefly 12 and then 11 and then just a girl who missed her father. He was your daddy, Clara said. He will always be your daddy. Nothing replaces that. No one replaces that. Elias has never once suggested otherwise. What if I forget him? Abby said. Her voice was very low. You won't, Clara said. Because I won't let you. Because we are going to tell his stories every single day. Because the way he laughed and the way he smelled like sawdust and the way he could do arithmetic in his head faster than any man I ever met, all of that stays. All of that is yours. Abby was quiet for a long moment. Does he know that's a condition? I'll tell him. Tell him it's not negotiable. It isn't, Clara agreed. Abby straightened up and smoothed her dress and was 13 again. Okay, she said. Then I think you should say yes. Grace looked up from her Bible. I already said yes in my heart, she said. I said it the first week. Nobody asked you, Lydia said. I know. I said it anyway. Annie stood up and walked to Clara and looked at her with those enormous serious eyes. "Mama," she said, "can I call him Pa?" The word landed in the room like something fragile and important. Clara looked at her youngest daughter. She thought about a man sitting very still in a chair with a 5-year-old asleep in his lap, because he hadn't wanted to disturb her. She thought about a man who had come into smoke and fire without hesitating. She thought about 5 reasons spoken quietly on a dirt road in the middle of July. "You'll have to ask him that yourself," Clara said. Annie nodded seriously. "I will ask him tomorrow," she said. "First thing." "Then that's settled," Grace said, and went back to her Bible. Rustic. Clara found Elias in the barn. He was not doing anything in particular, just standing with his hand on Clover's nose in the way she had seen Lydia do, that particular quiet of someone who needs a moment with a creature that doesn't ask questions. He turned when she came in. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Just that. "Yes," she said again, because she wanted to say it twice to be sure it was real. He crossed the barn floor and stood in front of her and took her hands, both of them, and held them between his, in the way you hold something you've been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. He didn't pull her close. He didn't rush anything. He just held her hands and looked at her, and she looked back. "Abby wants it understood that her father's memory is a condition," Clara said. "Non-negotiable." "It was never negotiable," he said. "I would have told her that myself if she'd asked." "She didn't ask. She told me to tell you." "That sounds right." He looked down at their hands. "She can ask me anything she needs to. About her daddy, about what I expect, about whether she can keep running the books." A pause. "I'd actually prefer if she kept running the books." "She knows," Clara said. "She's been keeping them since week 2. I know she has." He was quiet for a moment. "Annie's going to want to call me something that isn't Mr. Boone." "She is," Clara said. "She says she'll ask you herself tomorrow, first thing." Something moved across his face, quick and deep, and not entirely composed. He looked at their joined hands. "Tell her she doesn't have to wait until tomorrow," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "She's asleep," Clara said. "Right." He breathed out. "Right." Clara looked at this man, this rancher with ash on his coat and a burned barn, and a herd that was mostly, but not entirely, where it belonged, who had said 5 reasons to a woman he didn't know on a dirt road in July, and meant every word of it, and she thought that love the second time was a different thing than love the first time. The first time you didn't know what you were choosing. The second time you chose it, knowing exactly what it would cost and cost you, and you chose it anyway, with your eyes open and your hands steady. She squeezed his hands once. "Come inside, Elias," she said. "You've been in this barn long enough." He looked up at her, and for the first time since she had known him, the thing behind his eyes was not grief holding steady and not loneliness being managed. It was something lighter than both of those things combined. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he followed her out of the barn and into the summer evening, and toward the house where 4 girls were sleeping and the lights were on in the windows, and it looked exactly like what it was becoming. Annie asked him at breakfast. She had apparently been awake before anyone, sitting at the kitchen table in the early gray light, with her rocks arranged in a careful circle and a very specific expression on her face. The expression of someone who has rehearsed something and is now waiting for the right moment to perform it. Elias came through the back door at 6 in the morning, and Annie looked up at him and said without preamble, without building toward it in exactly the direct way that she did everything, "Can I call you Pa?" Elias stopped in the doorway. The kitchen was otherwise empty. Clara was still in the back room. The other girls were not yet up. It was just Annie at the table with her rocks and her question hanging in the air between them. He crossed the kitchen and crouched down in front of her chair, so they were at the same level, which Clara had noticed he always did. When he spoke to Annie seriously, always came down to her, instead of making her come up to him. "Your daddy was your pa," he said. "He always will be. You understand that?" Annie nodded. "Mama told us. And you still want to call me that?" Annie looked at him with those eyes that had never learned to be anything other than completely honest. "You came into the fire," she said. You came in when you didn't have to. That's what pa's do." Elias was quiet for a moment. His jaw moved once. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, it is." "So can I?" "Yes," he said. "You can." Annie nodded, as though this had been a formality she'd been confident about all along, and went back to her rocks. Elias stood up and turned toward the stove, and stood there for a moment with his back to the room, and Clara, who had come silently to the hallway doorway and heard all of it, did not walk in. She gave him that moment. She understood what it cost and what it healed at the same time, because she was beginning to understand that those two things were often the same thing. She went back to the bedroom and gave him 30 seconds, and then came in making noise with her shoes on the floorboards and said good morning, and started the coffee. And when she glanced at him, he was entirely composed and entirely different from the man who had stood in this kitchen 6 weeks ago, looking at a pot of beans, like a man who had forgotten what warmth felt like. Silas Crowe was gone from Guthrie within the month. Not dramatically, that was the thing about the way real collapses happen. They don't announce themselves. The association board found against his contamination complaint and levied a formal censure. The Land Office Review opened an inquiry into 2 prior filings that had Crowe's signature on them. Henderson filed his own complaint, and then a family named Birch filed one, and then a widow out near the river, whose name Clara never got straight, sent a written statement through Ruth Harlan's hands that laid out 2 years of pressure so methodical and so documented that it was almost impossible to argue against. Crowe left his office in Guthrie on a Tuesday in September. His lawyer told the association he was relocating his operations to the Texas Panhandle. Nobody went to see him off. Elias heard about it from the clerk at the land office, who sent a brief note that said only filed and closed. Water rights confirmed in perpetuity. Regards. He read it at the kitchen table with Clara sitting across from him, and he set it down and slid it toward her without saying anything. She read it. She set it back on the table between them. "It's over," he said. "That part is," she said. He looked at her. "What part comes next?" She stood up and poured him more coffee. "The building part," she said. "That's the better part anyway." They married on the last Saturday of September under the cottonwood trees in the south yard, which was where Clara had said she wanted it, and where Elias had built a simple arbor the week before, from oak timber, good timber this time, the kind that would last. Ruth Harlan stood with Clara. Deacon stood with Elias. The girls stood in a row in their best dresses, and Grace held the family Bible open to a passage she had selected herself, and read it aloud in her clear, unhurried voice, and nobody told her she hadn't been asked to, because the passage was exactly right and everyone knew it. The reverend from the Guthrie Church performed the ceremony. He was a plain-spoken man who did not waste words on either God or people, and the whole thing took 12 minutes, which Clara appreciated because she had never been comfortable being looked at by a large group of people. Afterward, when the reverend had gone, and the neighbors who had come for the occasion were eating from the tables Ruth and Mrs. Aldridge had organized with the specific military precision of women who had run community events for decades. Clara stood for a moment at the edge of the yard and looked at all of it. Elias talking to Henderson, who had become something close to a friend in the last few weeks. Lydia demonstrating something about Clover's Gate to 2 ranch hands, who were listening with the genuine attention of people learning something useful. Grace teaching Annie to read from the Bible, their 2 heads bent together over the same page. Ruth Harlan saying something to Mrs. Aldridge that made Mrs. Aldridge laugh so hard she had to put down her cup, and Abby standing near the cottonwood with a glass of lemonade watching all of it. Not guarding, not calculating, just watching the way a person watches something they love, and are learning to trust at the same time. She felt Elias come up beside her. He handed her a cup and stood where he always stood, close enough to be present, far enough to give her room. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, and meant it without qualification, which was new. "Thomas would have liked this," she said. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out the way true things came out when she wasn't managing herself carefully. He liked people who work hard and don't complain about it. He liked land that had good water. She paused. "He would have liked you." Elias was quiet for a moment. "I hope so," he said. I intend to honor what he built." She looked at him. "You already do," she said. "Every day." He touched the back of her hand with 2 fingers. Brief light, the particular tenderness of a man who is still careful with fragile things, even when they've proven they're not fragile. Then he went back to Henderson, and Clara stood under the cottonwoods in the September sun, and felt something she had not let herself feel since before the road and the broken axle and the red Oklahoma dust. She felt completely and without reservation that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The months that followed were not without difficulty, because nothing real is without difficulty, and Clara had long since stopped expecting otherwise. The new barn went up in October. Elias Deacon Henderson and 4 other men from the county who came without being asked and worked 2 weekends straight, because that was how things got built in this territory when people decided to stop watching and start helping. Abby kept the accounts for all of it, tracking every cost and every contribution with the precision that had become the family's running joke and its genuine foundation. The rebuilt barn was larger than the original. Clara had suggested the change in dimensions, calculating that they would need more stall space if Lydia was going to do what she was clearly going to do with horses. And Elias had looked at the new measurements and said, "You're right," and changed the plans without argument, which remained one of her favorite things about him. Lydia did what she was clearly going to do with horses. By the following spring, she had trained 3 animals that other ranchers had given up on, and word had spread in the specific way that word spreads in small communities, not through announcement, but through observation. Men rode out to the Boone Ranch and watched Lydia work, and went home and told their neighbors, and their neighbors came out and watched too, and by summer she had a quiet waiting list of difficult horses and a rate she had set herself after consulting with Abby about what the market would bear. She was 11 years old. She set her own rate, and it was fair, and she did not negotiate downward. And the ranchers paid it because the work was worth it. Grace spent the winter reading everything in the house and everything Ruth Harlan owned and everything the lending library in Guthrie would allow her to take home in a satchel. And by spring, she had read more than most adults in the territory had read in their lifetimes, and had opinions about all of it. She started teaching Annie to read in October, and had her reading simple sentences by December, which was faster than Clara had managed, and faster than Elias had thought possible. And Grace received this information with the moderate satisfaction of someone whose confidence in her own methods had simply been confirmed. Annie learned to read, and then immediately began reading aloud to anyone who would hold still, which meant the household was accompanied by a more or less constant narration of whatever book Grace had given her, delivered with the dramatic emphasis of a child who understood that reading was a performance, and not merely a transaction. Elias sat through a great deal of Annie reading to him in the evenings, and he listened with every appearance of genuine attention. And Clara caught him twice, actually engaged once, in a story about a boy and a horse that Annie read with such increasing urgency that he leaned forward slightly in his chair, and once when Annie read a passage about a father and his daughter, in a way that made the room briefly very quiet. Check. Spring came, and with it the thing nobody expected. Clara was in the kitchen on a Wednesday morning when Abby came through the door from the barn, with a look on her face that Clara had not seen before. Not the guarded, careful look, not the managing look, not even the focused ledger look. Something open. Something that was working to stay composed and not entirely managing it. "What happened?" Clara said, immediately rising. "Nothing bad." Abby said it quickly. "Nothing bad, Mama. I just—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, tried again. "He's in the barn. Elias, he has Daddy's watch." Clara went still. Thomas's pocket watch, the one Clara had pressed into Abby's hands at the graveside, because Abby was the oldest, and it had seemed right, and Abby had kept it in the bottom of her traveling bag since Kansas, through all the miles, and all the roads, and all the nights in the wagon, and the weeks on Elias's porch, and the whole long winter. She had never shown it to anyone. Clara had not asked about it, understanding that some things needed to be left alone until their owner was ready. "He has it," Clara said. "He found it when he was organizing the tack room." Abby's voice was very controlled. "It must have fallen out of my bag when I went to get the ledger last fall. I didn't know it was missing until just now. She stopped. He was fixing it. The watch was broken. The mainspring, Abby said. It stopped running 3 weeks after Daddy died and I couldn't. She stopped again, harder this time. I didn't know how to fix it, and I didn't want to take it to a stranger, and I kept carrying it, even though it didn't work, because I didn't know what else to do with it. Clara looked at her daughter for a moment. Then she said, "Go back." "Mama." "Abby, go back to the barn." Abby stood in the barn doorway. Elias was at the workbench with his back to the door, bent over something small, with the reading glasses he only wore for fine work perched on his nose. A watchmaker's cloth was spread under his hands. The watch was open on the cloth, its interior exposed, and he was working on something inside it with a tool Clara had not known he owned. He heard Abby come in. He turned and saw her face and looked at the watch and looked back at her. He did not apologize for having it. He did not perform guilt or explain himself at length. He said simply and directly, "The mainspring snapped. It's a clean break, I can fix it. I should have it running by this afternoon." Abby looked at the watch on the cloth. The watch her father had carried in his vest pocket every day of her life until the day he couldn't. "How did you know how to do that?" "My father had a watch he loved," Elias said. "It broke twice while he was alive. He fixed it twice. He showed me how." He looked at the watch. He said a man's watch is a personal thing. It shouldn't go to strangers. Abby stood in the doorway for a moment. She was not a girl who cried easily. She never had been, even as a small child, even at the graveside. But her eyes were bright now, in a way that meant she was making a decision about it. "You should have told me you found it," she said. "I know," he said. "I was going to bring it to you when it was running." He paused. "I thought a watch should be working when you give it back. A stopped watch is just a reminder of the stopping." Abby crossed the barn. She stood beside the workbench and looked at her father's watch laid open on the cloth, the small, careful mechanism of it, the inner workings of a thing that had measured out her father's days. Elias moved slightly to give her room, not retreating, just making space. "He wound it every morning," she said. "First thing, before coffee. He said if you start the day without knowing what time it is, the day starts without you." "That sounds right," Elias said. He wasn't a famous man or a rich man. She said it the way you say something you've been holding for a long time that needs to be said out loud to be real. He was just our father. He was just a good, ordinary man who worked hard and didn't cheat anyone and loved us the best way he knew how. She paused. "I'm scared people will forget that. When time passes, I'm scared he'll just be the man who died and left us nothing." Elias set down his tool and turned to face her fully. "Abby," he said, "I know 3 things about your father that nobody told me." She looked at him. "He raised a 13-year-old girl who reads financial ledgers and stands up in front of a room full of adults and doesn't shake," he said. "He raised a 10-year-old who understands horses better than most grown men I know. He raised a 7-year-old who believes that God is in the details and treats every person she meets like they're worth understanding." He paused. "And he raised a 5-year-old who walked into a fire because she thought someone needed help." He looked at her steadily. "That's not nothing, Abby. That's everything. That's what a man leaves behind when he's done it right." The barn was quiet. Abby looked at her father's watch on the cloth for a long moment. Then she looked at Elias, and something shifted in her face. Not collapsed, not broken. Just opened the way a door opens that has been closed for a long time, letting the air move through. She said it quietly. So quietly that she might have been saying it only to herself, except that he was close enough to hear it. "Thank you, Pa." 2 words. The same 2 words Annie had said months ago at the kitchen table in the bright early morning confidence of a 5-year-old who had already made up her mind. But in Abby's voice, coming from Abby's mouth, at the cost of everything it had cost her to get here, they were a completely different thing. They were not the easy words of a child who had not yet learned to be afraid. They were the hard-won words of a girl who had been afraid every single day for months, and had chosen in the end to put the knife down. Elias looked at the workbench. He breathed once, slow and controlled. "I'll have this ready by afternoon," he said. His voice was rougher than usual, and he did not try to hide it. Abby nodded. She turned and walked back toward the barn door. At the doorway she stopped, and she did the thing she almost never did. She reached back and took hold of the door frame for a moment, just to steady herself, just for a second, before she let go and walked out into the light. The watch was running by 3 o'clock. Elias brought it to Abby where she was sitting on the porch with the ledger. He set it on the page in front of her without ceremony, the case closed, the chain coiled beside it. She picked it up and held it in both hands and pressed it flat for a moment, feeling the tick of it move through her palms. She wound it once, the way her father had wound it. First thing. She put it in her apron pocket where it had belonged all along. "The numbers look good for next quarter," she said, and went back to the ledger. Elias sat down on the porch rail and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. The Boone Ranch in the years that followed was known across the Oklahoma Territory for several things, all of them earned. It was known for the horses, because Lydia Boone. She took the name the year she turned 13 on her own, without anyone suggesting it had a gift that could not be taught and would not be contained. And the horses she trained became the kind of horses people came long distances to acquire, and could not quite explain why they were better than other horses, except that they were. It was known for the books because Grace had eventually turned the front room into something that operated like a lending library, and people came from neighboring ranches to borrow and returned them, and sometimes stayed for supper and the conversation that came after. And Grace had opinions about everything they read, and was not shy about sharing them, and the conversations around the Boone table became the kind that people remembered. It was known quietly for the door that was never fully closed. A widow with 2 boys who had nowhere to winter. A family whose wagon broke on the road south. A young woman escaping a situation she didn't want to name who needed 3 weeks of safety and no questions. They came the way people come to places that have a reputation for kindness, not by advertisement, but by word passed from one person in need to the next, as precise and reliable as a map. Clara managed all of it, not because anyone told her to, but because it was what she was the person who saw the shape of a problem and solved it before the problem had finished introducing itself. Elias called her his left hand, meaning the hand that knew what was needed before the right hand reached for it, and she told him that was a fine compliment and he should have led with it on that dirt road in July instead of counting reasons. "I didn't know you yet in July," he said. "You knew enough," she said. "You stopped." "Anyone would have stopped." "They wouldn't," she said. "I know that for a fact, but you did." Abby was 23 when she left the ranch for the last time as a resident rather than a visitor. She left to marry a man named Cole Garrett, who was the son of the association man who had scheduled the Friday Review, a fact that Clara found quietly satisfying, and that Elias said nothing about, though his expression the day Cole Garrett asked his permission said everything. She left with the ledger system she had built for the Boone Ranch fully documented and handed to Clara because she said any business that couldn't run without the person who built it wasn't a business, it was a dependency, and she hadn't spent 10 years building a dependency. She also left with her father's pocket watch. Elias had resoldered the mainspring chain the previous winter without being asked after he noticed it was wearing thin. He handed it to her on the morning she left wrapped in the same watchmaker's cloth. "It needed one more repair," he said. She took the cloth and unwrapped it and looked at the watch and then at him. "You could have told me." "I didn't want to worry you," he said. "That," Abby said, "is the single most annoying thing you have ever done." "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." She put the watch in her pocket and hugged him briefly and hard the way she did everything all the way, and then done with it, no lingering. She hugged her mother for longer. "Take care of him," Abby said into Clara's shoulder. "He still forgets to eat when he's working on something." "I know he does," Clara said. "And the ledger. Abby." Clara pulled back and held her by the shoulders. "I know the ledger." "You know the ledger?" Abby agreed. She straightened up. She was 23, and she was composed, and she was entirely herself, the girl who had carried a kitchen knife in her apron across 3 states because the world had not yet proven it was safe. Who had read a financial document out loud in front of a room full of strangers and not shaken, who had said "thank you, Pa" in a barn one spring morning and meant every syllable of it. She was all of those things at once, and she was Thomas Whitmore's daughter and Clara Whitmore's daughter, and in the way that matters most, the way built from choice and time and showing up, she was Elias Boone's daughter too. She climbed into Cole's wagon and drove away down the road, and Clara watched until the wagon was gone, and then turned and found Elias standing beside her, which was where he usually was. "She'll be all right," she said. "She'll be better than all right," he said. "She'll be formidable." "She already is." "Gets it from her mother," he said. "She gets it from both," Clara said. "She told me so." That summer, a wagon broke down on the South Road, the same road, almost the same mile, where Clara's axle had split years before. A woman with 3 children, no money, and the particular look of someone holding themselves together through sheer necessity. Elias rode out when he saw the dust standing still. He came up to the wagon and looked at the axle and looked at the woman and looked at the 3 children. He took off his hat. "Elias Boone," he said, "this is my land on both sides of this road." The woman looked at him. She was braced for what came next. "I've got a ranch house half a mile south," he said. "Well, a kitchen, a barn. My wife makes a supper that'll make you forget the last 6 months." He paused. "We've got room, and we don't ask anything we haven't already been willing to give." The woman looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said. The same way Clara had almost said it years ago on this same road, not suspicious, just genuinely unable to account for it. "Because someone did it for us once," he said, "and now we do it for people coming after." He put his hat back on. "It's not charity, ma'am. It's just how things work when they're working right." He helped her down from the wagon. He led her family south along the road toward the house where the lights were already on in the kitchen, and a woman who had once had 43 cents and 4 daughters and a broken axle was already putting another pot on the stove because she had heard the horse leave, and she knew her husband, and she knew what he had gone out to do. That summer, a broken wagon wheel did not end a woman's life. It brought her to a door that was open, and a table that had room, and a family that had learned from hard miles and hard choices, and one quiet man who had stopped when he didn't have to, that the most lasting thing you can build on Oklahoma land is not a barn or a water right or a cattle herd. It is the kind of home that makes people feel for the first time in a long time that the world still has something in it worth trusting. The Boone Ranch stood for decades. The barn Elias rebuilt with good timber, and Clara's measurements outlasted every structure around it. The horses Lydia trained were ridden by people who never knew her name, but felt in the steadiness of those animals the result of a patience that had been practiced in the dark with no audience and no reward but the work itself. The books Grace organized passed through hundreds of hands and left traces in hundreds of minds. And the pocket watch that Thomas Whitmore had wound every morning of his life kept time on Abby's mantelpiece in a house she had built with her own hands and her own numbers until her own children were old enough to ask where it came from. She always told them the whole story, every part of it: the road, the axle, the man on the horse, the peaches in the jar, the fire, the lanterns on the ridge. The morning she stood in a barn and said 2 words that changed the shape of everything. She told it the way her mother had told her the important thing, straight through without softening, because the truth of it was better than any softened version could ever be. And she always ended it the same way. That summer she would say your grandmother thought a broken wagon wheel had ended her life. But sometimes the thing that breaks you open is the thing that lets the light find you. And sometimes one man's decency becomes a whole family's foundation, strong enough to hold every person who ever needed holding for as long as holding was required. That is what the Boone Ranch was. That is what it will always be. And it all started with 5 reasons not to turn away.